Hi, and welcome back to It's Not History, the podcast where the past is never dead. It's not even past. Episode 5, Bacon and Exile. So, last week, we looked at how a group of Iroquois language-speaking people migrated to the Susquehanna Valley, became known as the Susquehannock, and then established a position of dominance in the center of what's now Pennsylvania, and how they built communities that made a profound impression on the Europeans who contacted them. So, while the Europeans were discovering a new world, the Susquehannock were forced to discover a new world themselves. As historian Daniel Richter put it, the economic, ecological, and epidemiological changes unleashed by contact with Europeans had, quote, remade Indian country into a world every bit as new as that confronting transplanted Europeans in the same period. He goes on, native people, of course, did not literally travel to this Indian's new world, but the changes forced upon them were just as profound as if they had resettled on unknown shores. But the Susquehannock, being adept at adaptation, confronted this new world and, for a time, made it their own. They created and maintained a stable, sustainable, and profitable middle ground between three advancing and rival empires, one of them indigenous and two of them not. The Haudenosaunee to the north, the Dutch to the east and to the south, the newcomers, the English.
So while the Haudenosaunee are concentrating in what is today New York State, the Susquehannocks are moving south, and they establish themselves in the lower Susquehanna Valley, where they happen to be even more favorably situated economically than the Haudenosaunee are, because at the same time they're moving there, and probably not coincidentally, the Dutch and the Swedes are establishing themselves in the Delaware Valley.
This is Daniel Richter. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of one of my favorite books on the topic, Facing East from Indian Country.
Maryland and Virginia are establishing themselves in the Chesapeake Bay area, and both those places are within easy commuting distance of where the Susquehannocks are. So they have access to all this trade goods from multiple sources, and are able to, at least for a brief period, for a generation or so in the mid-17th century, become probably the dominant military power in the whole region, even more important probably than the Haudenosaunee were at that point.
The Susquehannock established themselves not just militarily, they also thrived in the new trade economy, an economy that was built around the largest rodent in North America, beavers. Beaver pelts fueled a bubble economy in which the Susquehannock proved masters. On one side of their community, they had ready access to the raw commodity, beavers and their fur, and literally on the other side, exclusive access to the market, Dutch traders, willing to pay in the hard commodities that the native economy and native lifestyle was becoming dependent on. Manufactured goods, such as copper pots, woven cloth, and guns. But, like all bubbles, it wouldn't last. Beavers disappeared, and their removal meant the removal of their dams and the wetlands that they had created. This permanently altered the ecology on which hunter-gatherers like the Susquehannock had depended for millennia, and this in turn making them fully dependent on this Indian New World economy centered on trade with Europeans. But even this was about to change. By this time, the Susquehannock and other native people had recognized that the English, the somewhat pathetic latecomers to the continent, were not going to stay in their box, the contained coastal settlements, the way their rivals, the Dutch, did. The English, it was becoming clear, were different. The Dutch, as you may recall, had a business model that was all business, set up trade and leave the land and the politics to the locals, making them, from an indigenous perspective, easy to do business with. But the Dutch, they were on their way out.
What happens? Very importantly, the English conquer New Netherland, remove the Dutch government, although not Dutch traders, from the equation, deeply upset all of the balanced economic relationships that had depended on trading with the Dutch of New Netherland, what is today New York, New Jersey, parts of Delaware, parts of Pennsylvania. And it disrupted those trading connections, and this has really hit the Susquehannocks hard. At the same time, there's conflicts between Maryland and Virginia over who owns particular islands where trading posts have been set up. All this means that at the height of their military power, the Susquehannocks are disrupted. And for whatever reason, probably having to do with epidemics, probably a big battle or a series of big battles in the early 1670s, the Susquehannocks have to leave their main capital at what it was then and is today known as Conestoga, and try to relocate somewhere else farther south. And they send a delegation to the Maryland government to say, can we resettle within the boundaries of Maryland? Will you give us land to do that? There's considerable reluctance on the part of the Maryland government to do that. They finally agree to let them settle on the Potomac.
The Potomac River is where the first lasting English settlement, Jamestown, still survived. The royal charter, the license that initially sanctioned the outpost, had expired, and the English government took control, making it a crown colony. Jamestown became the seat of government, with the Virginia House of Burgess becoming the first colonial legislature in English North America. The first wave of English, as you probably recall, had come for gold and silver, but had found disease, depletion, and starvation. But now they found a more sustainable commodity, tobacco. Tobacco proved to be only marginally sustainable. Large-scale farming of tobacco rapidly depleted the soil, and this, combined with falling commodity prices, pushed the English settlers farther from the coast and deeper into native territory, forcing the native population to fully appreciate really how different the English in fact were. The Dutch model, trade and stay off the land. The English model was get land. Land they desperately needed to support an expanding plantation economy whose hunger for land was proving insatiable. So English colonists on the coast eventually slashed their way into the back country and into the refuge that the last remnants of the Susquehanna had carved out for themselves in the estuaries of the Chesapeake Bay. The English needed the land, and the Susquehannock, after years of forced migration, were in no mood to be moved. Conflict became inevitable. And when the conflict did come, it was a horrific preview of what was to come for all concerned. So the trigger for this conflict, when it did come, turned out to be an almost comical, stumbling, bumble-headed incursion by a group of English settlers looking for Indians who they thought had stolen a pig. The colonists opened fire on a cabin where they thought the perpetrators were hiding. There was no pig. The colonists had unwittingly kicked a hornet's nest. The enraged men who emerged were not the Indians they were looking for, but formerly friendly Susquehannocks. And they were no longer friendly. And the Virginians quickly find a way to make a bad situation even worse.
A few months later, they send a delegation to the new Susquehannock town, lure all the chiefs out of the stockades, and massacre. So they provoke this war against the Susquehannocks.
The Susquehannocks deeply felt this betrayal. Matthew Crewer, in his masterful work, Time of Anarchy, Indigenous Power and the Crisis of Colonialism in Early America, writes, expressions of peace and love gave way to betrayal and grief in the midst of a war that neither people had expected. One Susquehannock captain, as so often colonial authors did not bother to identify him by name, asked the Virginia governor, quote, what was it that moved him to take up arms against his professed friend? The friend being the Susquehannock. He declared his grief to find the Virginians, once thought friends, without any cause given to become his foes. So I'd like to take a moment to consider these feelings of grief and betrayal. As we've talked about before, and as we'll continue to discover, settlers native lived in very different worlds, with very different perceptions and very different social constructs. The English operated in a world where treaties and agreements, borders and boundaries were the path to organizing a society. But for Native Americans, Crewer points out that Susquehannock political structures were egalitarian, built around reciprocity, rather than hierarchical institutions of Eurasian states. For the Susquehannock and other indigenous peoples, social relationships and kinship were the organizing profile that defined a fluid network, a cloud of relationships bonded by good feelings. And while this might sound trite, as Crewer explains, quote, feelings were profoundly political, and politics was inseparable from emotion. In the emotional arc that connected Susquehannocks and settlers in the 17th century, Love and grief shaped collective actions that led people to peace or war. These particular emotions were fundamental to the way that Native societies understood the proper organization of the body politic, the healthy functioning of society, and the correct methods of dealing with outsiders. Emotions formed the ligaments of political order. Both peoples struggled to create and maintain order amid the upheavals introduced by European colonization, seizing opportunities and minimizing dangers in order to create powerful nations. These were, in every sense, emotional struggles. The emotional basis of society and politics shaped how Susquehannock and English societies evolved over the course of the 17th century. It braided their struggles together, even when order broke down and nations fell apart. The paramount social value of the Susquehannocks was peace, which signified not only the absence of conflict, but also emotional calm and mutual goodwill. Grief was the most dangerous threat to peace. Susquehannocks experienced with the death of a loved one as a trauma that caused fury, despair, and self-destructive madness. Without healing, that trauma would consume the deranged individual and could cause damage or destroy the entire community. They had condolence rituals which were designed to restore peace, but sometimes ceremony was not enough. Kruger continues, "It was this grief that cast the Susquehannocks into a state their indigenous relatives described as a, quote, turbulent, bloody mind, moving them to take revenge for the Virginians' treachery and seek restitution for their slain kindred. They fought a war that brought, quote, violent and deadly fears into the life of every colonist. Though they were depleted and diminished by disease and dispersal, the Susquehannock diaspora fought back, taking the fight to the English and burning settlements and killing a number of English along the borderlands. But this was just the sort of provocation Virginia's English governor, Sir William Berkeley, was looking for. Berkeley had long advocated for the enslavement or destruction of native people and the seizure of Indian land in his territory. And now he had his excuse to make it happen. So he raised a force of 750 men in Virginia. Neighboring Maryland sent 250 men, and so a force of 1,000 English armed men marched on a Susquehannock settlement that numbered not half of that. Throughout the summer of 1675, the Susquehannock soldiers held off the larger colonial forces, and then retreated into the Virginia frontier as winter came. Then they continued a guerrilla campaign throughout the winter, and by the spring of 1676, the Virginia borderland was in chaos. Dozens of plantations were abandoned, and scores of English dead. A young woman, Elizabeth Bacon, living in this borderland, wrote to a sister in London, "I pray God keep the worst enemy I have from ever being in such a sad condition as I have been in." Her family was wealthy, and she slept in a feather bed with linen sheets. But beside her bed, she said, was a, quote, basket with 8 hand grenadoes, iron shells loaded with powder and fitted with a fuse. This is Daniel Richter.
Berkeley, who had gathered around himself an elite of people who had monopolized much of the land and dominated the trade with native peoples, and in particular dominated what was an increasingly ugly and profitable trade in native captives who were becoming slaves. So Berkeley and his circle controlled not only most of the land, but also the profits of the Indian trade, and in particular the profits of the slave trade in native people.
The failure of Thomas Berkeley's colonial government to secure the frontier and protect its inhabitants, as well as the clear profiteering by his cronies and inner circle, pushed Virginia to the edge of civil war. Blood stained the ground and revolution was in the air. And into this cauldron strode one of the great opportunists in American history. Enter Elizabeth Bacon's husband, Nathaniel. Nathaniel Bacon would now become America's first heartland populist. More would follow, but Bacon created the recipe and set the table. Bacon was an ambitious man, educated at Cambridge, married well, and arrived in Virginia, in the words of historian Pekka Hämäläinen, with a whiff of shadiness and plenty of silver. He moved quickly into both elite and lower-class circles. He traded with Indians, became a leader among Virginia's frontiersmen, and used his connections to Berkeley to win a seat on the governor's council. He owned a plantation in Curls Neck on the James River near the fall line, where he lived with his pregnant wife Elizabeth and their infant daughter. Daniel Richter.
This new aristocratic guy named Nathaniel Bacon shows up. He becomes the kind of elite person around which the people who are opposed to Berkeley can rally.
In Bacon's view, the whole place was a swamp that needed draining. And Bacon thought he was just the man to pull the plug. To do this, he raised an army of colonists and their servants called Bacon's Volunteers. Dan Richter.
And he becomes the voice of people who are saying, let's stop being so nice to the Indians. In particular, let's stop being so nice to the Indians in a way that only profits Berkeley. Let's have a nice little war to get some more land. Let's open up this slave trade to anybody who go out there and kill some Indians, capture some Indians and make them slaves. And this is what this little spark about the theft of the hogs escalates then into this whole process whereby Bacon comes to be seen as the leader of the people, the disfranchised people who see war against all native peoples as a solution to their economic problems and also the solution to their hatred for the monopoly that Berkeley and Company have created over all these great resources in Virginia.
So the volunteers headed south down the Chesapeake hunting for Susquehannock. They didn't find them. What they did find was a village of Occaconeechis, who offered up several Susquehannock prisoners that they had captured. Bacon, however, was not in the mood to observe the subtleties of tribal allegiance. To him, an Indian was an Indian. He had his men kill everyone in the village. Bacon wrote back to the governor, quote, "We have destroyed about 100 men and 2 of their kings, beside women and children, giving great satisfaction to the people." The people were the colonists. The Occaconeechis were not satisfied. The message was clear. Hunting Susquehannock was a pretense. The English mission, Bacon and his malicious mission, was an indiscriminate slaughter of native people. The governor and the political elites were enraged, and more than a little terrified. The English foothold on the continent was still barely just that. And even though they were depleted and dispersed, native people still outnumbered them. So they branded Bacon an outlaw and called for a general election to the House of Burgess, the Virginia legislature, supposedly to firm up support for the governor. But Bacon, ever the populist, was elected to a seat on the council. So now, the even more enraged governor demanded that Bacon come to Jamestown and kneel before him. So Bacon came to Jamestown with an army of 500 men behind him. He and his army then occupied Jamestown. He probably did not kneel. Bacon then demanded that the legislature make him a general and authorize a campaign to destroy all natives in Virginia, which his allies in the Burgess did. Bacon's army then raged across Virginia, ostensibly searching for the Susquehannock. They didn't find them. They didn't care. Killing Indians, all Indians they found, peaceful Paumunkes, Nanzaticos, Rappahannocks, Portabacos, Waicocomocos, and Appomattox, suited them just fine. And all this was now legal because while all this was going on, the Bacon faction in the legislature passed laws enslaving all natives in Virginia and banishing them from their land. This, of course, was no coincidence. Many of Bacon's followers were some form of tobacco farmers, likely impoverished. And back to tobacco. Tobacco needed a lot of land, which they now had in the form of former Indian land. And tobacco needs labor, ideally free labor, which they now also had in the form of formerly free, now enslaved natives. Check and check. Next, Governor Berkeley sent a force to Jamestown to try to gain control of it from the Baconites who now occupied it. In the struggle, Jamestown was burned to the ground. The war against the Susquehannocks had now morphed into an English civil war in Virginia. Virginia was now a complete shit show. When word of this reached King Charles II in England, a man with first-hand experience of civil wars and their aftermath, he fired the governor, placed the colony under military occupation, and sent in the army. 1,000 British regulars to restore order. He then summoned Berkeley back to England to do some explaining, and ordered Bacon captured, tried, and if possible, hung. Mercifully for both men, they conveniently died before they could be brought to account. Berkeley on his way back to London, and Bacon from dysentery in Virginia. Shitting yourself to death seems a fitting ending for this guy. Bacon's movement expired with him. 20 of his conspirators were hanged, and a year later, the new governor of Virginia would seek to mend indigenous fences, literally and figuratively, abolishing the native slave trade and banning colonists from a 3-mile buffer zone around all native settlements. But this would prove short-lived and cold comfort to the countless hundreds of native men, women, and children murdered and enslaved so that tobacco could grow without hindrance in Virginia. And, as we'll see in our next episode, this addiction to land and enslaved people to feed an insatiable plantation economy would shortly cause violence on a global scale. But for now, briefly, that thirst was quenched. The long night of Virginia was about to end, and to the north a new day was dawning, and the Susquehannock would find sanctuary there thanks to a religious outcast who called into debt to a king. The king was Charles I of England. In 1649, he had ended up on the wrong side of history, losing both the English Civil War and his head, literally. But not before he had borrowed a large, actually truly huge, sum of money from an English aristocrat, Admiral Sir William Penn. After the monarchy was later restored, and Charles's son, Charles, was placed on the throne, Sir William's son, William, came calling to call in the debt. And if he wanted cash, he didn't get it. What he got instead was land. A lot of land. So join us next time when we find out how much land a king is willing to pay to settle a 16,000 pound debt in the 1600s. Land, by the way, that didn't belong to him. Land that, from the Susquehannock perspective, didn't belong to anyone, but that they still called home. Quick footnote. This was the Stuart monarchy, so the Charleses we were talking about are, Charles Stuart, full disclosure. So join us next time on It's Not History. I'd like to thank our contributors, Daniel Richter and Matthew Kruer. Their work in the show notes at itsnothistory.com. And please remember to like and share with a friend. They will thank you for it. And remember, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Thanks for listening.